We are often told that time heals all wounds, and that 30 years is more than enough for the earth to swallow the secrets of the dead. But in old families, wrapped in isolation and unspoken regrets, some departures leave a permanent scar on the fabric of a house. I thought my childhood memories were just playing tricks on me. I didn't know that a tragic, forgotten entity from our bloodline had been watching me from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to remind us of the debt we owed her. It started in the late summer of 2012 in a secluded, historic farming town in western Massachusetts. My name is Vivian, and like most people raised in the quiet countryside, I grew up surrounded by old structures, ancient family trees, and generational accounts that the local elders preferred to keep buried. Our family had always been tightly knit, anchored by my paternal grandmother, a stern, deeply conservative woman who ruled our household with an iron fist. But beneath her rigid exterior lay a dark, unspoken past. When she was a young mother, long before I was born, she had been deeply involved in a radical, local spiritualist movement, an intense phase of mediumship and occult practice that she conducted right out of our family basement. It was a dark, volatile period that stopped abruptly and completely the exact year my mother married into the family, as if a heavy door had been slammed shut and locked away forever. My grandmother had raised 8 children in that old farmhouse, but the family layout carried a profound, hollow grief. 2 of my aunts had passed away long before I ever existed. One of them, Aunt Clara, was the identical twin sister of my living Aunt Cynthia. My mother eventually whispered the tragic reality to me when I was old enough to understand. When Aunt Clara was just 17, she had fallen desperately in love with a boy from a rival farming family down the valley. My grandmother, fueled by an uncompromising pride and her volatile spiritualist leanings, violently forbade the relationship, isolating Clara within the house. Driven to absolute despair, Aunt Clara walked into the upper loft of the old timber barn behind the house one rainy afternoon and took her own life. The fallout was catastrophic. To scrub the stain from the family name, my grandmother executed a total erasure of Clara's existence. She locked away every photograph, banned the mention of her name from the dinner table, and hid her memory deep in the attic. For over 30 years, Aunt Clara became a ghost in the literal and figurative sense, a forbidden chapter of our history. My first direct encounter with the residual static of that tragedy occurred when I was only 5 years old. It was the same age my father had been when Clara passed away. My paternal great-grandmother, my grandmother's mother, had passed away from old age at 92, and the family gathered at her isolated colonial estate for the private viewing and casketing ceremony. Because there was no one available to watch me, my mother dragged me along, keeping me close to the edge of the crowded parlor. The atmosphere inside the estate was heavy, suffocating, and thick with the scent of formaldehydes, damp wool, and stale lilies. Dozens of weeping relatives crowded around the open wooden casket in the center of the room. I remember standing near the hallway door, looking through the cracked frame into the parlor as the funeral directors prepared to seal the lid. Amidst the sea of moving, crying adults, my eyes were suddenly drawn to a figure standing near the far corner of the room, completely separate from the crowd. It was a young woman. She had short, sharply cut dark hair, and she was wearing a crisp, vintage white button-down shirt paired with formal black trousers. But she wasn't looking at the casket. She wasn't crying. Her body was turned completely away from the dead, her head cocked at an unnatural, rigid angle as she stared directly through the doorway, locking her eyes straight onto mine. Even at 5 years old, the sight sent a freezing jolt down my spine. Her expression was completely blank, her pale skin contrasting sharply against the dark wallpaper of the parlor. There was an intense, heavy familiarity in her gaze, a look that made my throat tighten with an unexplained panic. But being a child, my focus quickly drifted, and I ran off to the kitchen to find a glass of water, completely forcing the image into the back of my mind. Years passed, and the memory of that strange girl faded into a dull, forgotten blur. It wasn't until I turned 22 that the truth violently broke through the surface of our reality. My sister and I are fraternal twins, and as we grew into adulthood, the older relatives at family reunions began to constantly murmur behind our backs, whispering that I carried an uncanny, identical physical disposition to the late Aunt Clara. The same sharp jawline, the same intense stare. Following a severe illness that left my grandmother fragile and contemplative, she finally relented on her decades of forced silence. She permitted my father to retrieve Clara's old belongings from the attic, allowing her formal portrait to be placed on the living room mantelpiece for the very first time. I was sitting on the sofa when my father brought the dusty, heavy oak frame downstairs and set it above the brick fireplace. I looked up at the photograph, and my entire world completely lost its color. The blood rushed out of my face, and my hands shook so violently I dropped my mug onto the carpet. Staring back at me from the vintage photograph was the exact same girl from the great-grandmother's viewing 17 years ago. It was the identical short, sharp haircut, the exact same vintage white button-down shirt, the same piercing, unblinking eyes that had tracked me through the crowded funeral parlor when I was a child. There was absolutely no mistake. Aunt Clara had returned to her mother's viewing, entirely unseen by the adults who had wiped her from memory, choosing instead to reveal her restless form to the one child who carried her face. The haunting reached its terrifying peak late last August, on the exact anniversary of Clara's tragic passing. 30 years of buried resentment exploded into our domestic space. The night before the family was scheduled to hold a quiet, late summer memorial dinner, my uncle, Clara's younger brother, who slept in the ground floor bedroom of the old farmhouse, experienced a horrific episode of sleep paralysis. He told us he woke up at exactly 2 a.m. to a sudden, catastrophic drop in room temperature. The air turned so cold his breath misted in the dark, and a heavy, suffocating weight dropped onto his chest, completely pinning his limbs to the mattress. As he strained to move his eyes, he saw a dark, blurry human silhouette materialize out of the empty air beside his closet door. The shadow glided smoothly to the edge of his bed. As it stepped into the faint moonlight filtering through the window, my uncle realized it was Clara. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her jaw dropping open as a distorted, hollow rasp tore out of her lips, echoing through his mind. "Bring down my clothes, burn my letters, build me a house, or I will never let this family rest." The entity leaned down, her freezing fingers brushing against his neck before vanishing into the floorboards. The moment the weight lifted, my uncle bolted out of bed, screaming for my father. The sheer panic in his voice brought the entire household downstairs. Driven by an absolute wave of slow-burn paranoia, my paper and uncle didn't wait for morning. They took a flashlight, sprinted up to the attic, and dragged down every remaining box of Clara's vintage clothes, her old diaries, and her teenage letters. My father even spent the remaining hours of the night in the garage, hastily constructing a small, beautiful wooden model of a traditional house out of cedar scraps. At dawn, before the sun could fully break over the valley, we gathered in the backyard. My father built a massive bonfire in the stone pit. One by one, we threw Clara's rotted silk blouses, her handwritten notes, and the small cedar house into the roaring flames, reciting quiet prayers for safe passage and begging her spirit to release our bloodline from her grief. As the wooden model house caught fire, a strange pressurized column of white smoke rose straight up into the air, twisting into a perfect, tight spiral before completely snapping out into the blue sky. Since that morning by the bonfire, the oppressive, stagnant atmosphere that had plagued the old farmhouse for decades has completely cleared. My uncle hasn't experienced another episode of paralysis, and the living room feels normal, quiet, and warm. No one else in our community has spotted the girl in the white shirt wandering near the perimeter of the estate. But every now and then, when the late summer afternoon sun hits the living room mantelpiece, casting long shadows across Clara's portrait, I find myself stopping in front of the mirror in the hallway. I stare at my own reflection, looking at the sharp jawline and the intense, familiar eyes I share with the dead. I know the fire consumed her belongings, and I know my family thinks the debt is paid. But as the darkness rolls in over the valley, a freezing thought lingers in the back of my brain, wondering if Aunt Clara was truly satisfied with a house made of burning wood, or if she's simply biding her time, waiting to slip back through the door of the one reflection that belongs entirely to her. We are taught to seek final goodbyes at the bedside of our passing loved ones, believing that the hospital room is the absolute boundary of their earthly presence. But when a sudden tragedy strikes down the lines of communication, the mind becomes trapped in a hollow loop of unfinished conversations. I didn't know that my father's final message wouldn't be spoken in the daylight, but delivered as a chilling, scented draft directly into my ear, while the rest of the house lay completely asleep. It started in the damp, freezing transition of early spring in a quiet suburban town in upstate New York. My name is Amber, and at the time, my life was defined by the exhausting rhythmic routine of a factory worker. I spent my days standing over a cutting table at a local textile mill, a job that was growing progressively harder because I was currently 6 months pregnant with my first child. My husband and I lived in a large, slightly drafty colonial household owned by his parents, sharing the space with his older brother and his brother's wife. It was a crowded domestic arrangement, but we maintained a stable, quiet existence until a sudden, devastating call from the county hospital ripped our reality apart. My father, a rugged, fiercely independent man who had spent 40 years working as a heavy mechanical contractor, had suffered an abrupt, catastrophic stroke while working in his garage. By the time the emergency medical technician stabilized him and got him to the regional medical center, the neurological damage was absolute. The stroke had completely destroyed his motor skills, paralyzing the entire right side of his body and completely stripping away his ability to articulate words. I sat by his bedside for 2 straight days, listening to the sterile rhythmic beep of the heart monitor and the low hiss of the oxygen line. It was an agonizing experience. My father's mind was entirely intact behind his blank eyes. He could hear me, he could recognize my face, but his mouth could only form small, silent tremors. The doctors eventually pulled my mother and me into the hallway, their faces cast in a grim, professional solemnity. They explained that his vital organs were rapidly entering a state of terminal decline, and there was absolutely nothing left for modern medicine to execute. They suggested discharging him and utilizing a private transport ambulance to bring him back to his own house, allowing him to pass away peacefully in familiar surroundings rather than beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit. While my mother coordinated the final transit paperwork at the nurse's station, I went back into the room to hold his calloused hand. As I leaned over his pillow, my father began to weep silently, heavy tears cutting deep lines down his pale, weathered face. His gaze was fixed on mine, full of a frantic, trapped desperation, a primal urge to say something to his pregnant daughter that his failing tongue could no longer deliver. I squeezed his hand, choking back my own tears, and whispered, "Dad, just hold on until the transport gets here. I'm taking you back to your house. We're going home." But the universe was completely unyielding. Mid-transit, less than 2 miles away from his driveway, the air pressure inside the cramped, rattling frame of the private ambulance shifted. My father's vitals flatlined instantaneously. He closed his eyes and drifted away into the dark, leaving this world without producing a single parting word or a final directive for the family. The emotional fallout over the next 48 hours was hollow and exhausting. Because I was heavily pregnant and my blood pressure was dangerously elevated from the pure, unadulterated grief, my mother and husband firmly insisted that I shouldn't endure the overnight wake at the local chapel. After the first formal evening service, my husband drove me back to his parents' house, commanding me to crawl straight into bed to rest. My husband's family belonged to an incredibly traditional, strict Catholic parish. Their household was sterile of any eccentric spiritual items or alternative Eastern relics. Heavy wooden crucifixes and old framed lithographs of saints lined every corridor, and the air inside usually smelled of nothing but floor wax and laundry detergent. Around midnight, while the entire house was dead silent, my sister-in-law went out onto the covered rear porch to take down a batch of clothes before a heavy spring storm rolled in over the valley. As she pulled the sheets from the line, she glanced through the glass partition into the dark central hallway. She froze, a small, perfectly spherical orb of pale blue-green light, what old-timers sometimes call an ignis fatuus or a will-o'-the-wisp, was drifting smoothly through the dark space. It didn't flicker or crackle. It glided horizontally 3 feet above the floorboards, moving with a deliberate, gentle momentum until it slipped perfectly beneath the wooden frame of my closed bedroom door. My sister-in-law, raised with a quiet awareness of traditional anomalies, dropped her laundry basket, walked into her own room, and frantically whispered to her husband, "Amber's father just entered the house. His spirit is inside her room." Inside the pitch-black bedroom, I was trapped in a deep, catatonic sleep, my body aching from the heavy physical toll of the pregnancy and the funeral. Suddenly, I didn't wake up visually, but my somatic senses spiked into a state of absolute, localized alertness. I felt a sudden, freezing drop in the ambient room temperature, so severe that my skin instantly broke into goosebumps. Then, I felt the distinct, heavy weight of a physical presence leaning directly over the left side of my mattress. Before I could even process the panic to open my eyes, a soft, incredibly warm, pressurized draft of air was blown directly into my left ear canal. It felt exactly like a human mouth framing a wordless exhale against my skin. The heat of the breath cut through the freezing air of the room, but it was the olfactory sensation that made my heart slam violently against my ribs. The breath carried a rich, overwhelming aroma, the unmistakable, thick scent of heavy ceremonial incense. There was absolutely no incense in this Catholic house. The aroma was so dense it felt organic, filling my throat and my lungs with a comforting, sacred warmth that seemed to wash away the sharp, burning knot of grief in my chest. It was a message delivered without syllables, a silent sensory declaration that he was finally free from the paralyzed cage of his flesh, and that he had used his very first breath on the other side to track down his daughter. I bolted upright in the dark, my fingers frantically reaching for the nightstand lamp. The room was completely empty. The air conditioning was humming quietly, but the thick, fragrant scent of ceremonial incense lingered vividly around my pillow for a full minute before slowly evaporating into the night. I sat there in the dark and cried, but for the first time since the stroke, the tears weren't driven by despair. They were driven by a profound, bittersweet clarity. It has been several months since that night, and my baby girl was born healthy and safe. The heavy grief that had anchored our household has slowly transitioned into a quiet acceptance. But the visitations didn't stop with that single breath. Multiple times a week, usually around 3 a.m. during the deepest lull of the night, I will suddenly jolt awake for no apparent reason. When I look toward the foot of my bed, I will see the distinct, semi-translucent silhouette of my father standing quietly within the frame of my open bedroom doorway. He never steps across the threshold into the room. He never attempts to touch my sheets, and he never utters a single sound. He simply stands there in the dim moonlight, his hands resting gently in his pockets, looking down at the wooden crib where his granddaughter sleeps with a soft, gentle, deeply peaceful smile on his face, before slowly dissolving back into the morning fog. My husband thinks it's just a residual projection born from a psychological longing, and my mother thinks it's a blessing from the parish saints. But as I stay awake in the quiet hours, listening to my daughter's soft breathing, a freezing, lingering thought remains in the back of my mind, realizing that though his voice was stolen in the daylight, the veil between us is thin enough that my father will always find a way to whisper his protection over the cradle where we sleep. We tend to think of old factories as loud, chaotic machines, entirely defined by the frantic energy of the daylight shifts. But when the assembly lines go dead and the workers empty out for the midday break, the silence that settles into the concrete can become terrifyingly heavy. I used to think the local rumors about our factory's perimeter were just harmless folklore told to pass the time. I didn't know that by staying behind for a solitary lunch hour, I would accidentally step into a silent, spectral march that has been repeating itself for decades. It started in the blistering, humid peak of mid-July 2017 in a fading industrial town nestled along the Susquehanna River in rural Pennsylvania. My name is Elena, and for nearly 7 years, I've spent my days working as an assembly line operator at a historic garment factory. The facility is a massive, low-slung structure built from corrugated steel and weathered cinder blocks, where rows of commercial sewing machines create a perpetual, deafening roar from dawn until dusk. It's exhausting, repetitive work, but it provides a stable living in a town where options are few. The most defining feature of our workplace, however, isn't the machinery. It's the property line. Running directly along the northern edge of our employee parking lot is a low, crumbling stone wall covered in overgrown ivy. Just beyond that wall lies the County Military Veterans Cemetery, a historic resting ground dating back to the mid-20th century. Hundreds of uniform, white marble headstones march in perfect, silent rows down the grassy hillside under the wide valley sky. Because we lived and worked so close to the dead, the older workers on the floor often whispered about strange atmospheric anomalies, unexplained cold drafts in the loading docks, or the faint scent of old canvas and boot polish lingering in the corridors after a heavy rain. I always laughed it off, chalking it up to the active imaginations of tired women. The turning point came on a suffocating Thursday afternoon. At exactly 12 p.m., the main factory whistle blew, signaling our mandatory 1-hour midday break. Within 5 minutes, the assembly floor cleared out completely. Nearly all 20 women on my shift grabbed their bags and either drove home or walked across the highway to the local diner to escape the stagnant heat under the metal roof. I chose to stay behind. The tension mechanism on my commercial sewing machine had jammed during the morning rush, and I was terrified of falling behind on my daily production quota. I knew that if I spent the lunch hour repairing the feed dogs myself, I could secure my bonus by nightfall. The silence that followed was abrupt and deeply unsettling. The moment the facility manager cut the main breaker to the assembly line, the deafening mechanical roar vanished, replaced by an absolute, heavy quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. The air conditioning was entirely absent on the factory floor, and within minutes, the air turned dense and thick, smelling of hot rust, machine oil, and dry cotton dust. The only sound left in the entire building was the occasional metallic groan of the old boiler system settling in the walls. By 12:30 p.m., my fingers were slick with grease, and my throat felt completely parched from the dust. I wiped my hands on an old rag and decided to walk down to the communal restroom to wash up before the shift resumed. The women's restroom was located at the far northern corner of the concrete structure, placed down a long, narrow corridor that sat directly adjacent to the cemetery stone wall. It was a dim, antiquated space featuring 3 stained porcelain sinks beneath a spotted mirror and 4 heavy wooden stalls with swinging doors. The back wall of the restroom featured 2 high horizontal windows made of thick, frosted privacy glass, looking right out over the oldest row of military graves. As I pushed open the heavy fire door and stepped onto the red tile floor, the temperature inside the restroom dropped significantly. It felt strangely cool compared to the sweltering heat of the assembly floor, but my mind was completely focused on the grime under my fingernails, so I ignored it. I walked to the center sink, turned the old brass faucet, and let the cold water run over my wrists. Suddenly, a strange low-frequency vibration rattled the plumbing inside the walls. The water sputtering from the faucet instantly slowed to a dark, rusty drip before completely cutting off. I frowned, jiggling the handle, but the pipes just let out a hollow, rhythmic clicking sound. Then the heavy fire door at the end of the narrow concrete corridor outside clicked open. I held my breath, listening intently. I didn't hear any footsteps. No click of heels or scuff of sneakers that usually signaled one of my coworkers returning early. Instead, there was a slow, heavy, sliding sound, like a thick fabric or heavy rubber soles being rhythmically dragged across the concrete floorboards. The sound moved closer and closer, stopping right outside the restroom entrance. A sudden wave of intense somatic anxiety tightened in my throat. I stood perfectly still by the sinks, my eyes glued to the bottom gap of the wooden stall doors behind me. The ambient light filtering through the frosted windows suddenly dimmed, as if a thick cloud had blocked the sun. Through the narrow gap beneath the stall doors, I watched multiple shadows materialize out of the empty corridor. They didn't look like human feet. They were dense, pitch black, blurry masses of shade that smoothly glided across the red tile, completely blocking out the faint light from the hallway. 1, 2, 3, 4 distinct silhouettes slid into the room, pacing back and forth behind the wooden partitions. My heart began to slam violently against my ribs. I couldn't scream. The air in the room grew so freezing cold that my breath began to form thin, white plumes of mist in front of my face. I watched multiple shadows materialize out of the empty corridor. In the reflection of the glass, I could see the back wall of the restroom clearly. Walking in a slow, perfect, rhythmic line across the tile were the translucent, blurry silhouettes of 4 tall men. They looked like faded charcoal drawings brought to life, completely devoid of distinct facial features, but their clothing was unmistakable. They were wearing heavy, vintage military-issue utility jackets and thick combat helmets. They moved with a stiff, coordinated, military-style gait, completely ignoring my presence as they marched from the entrance toward the deep utility closet at the back of the room. I was a devout, practicing Catholic, raised in a traditional household where my father and uncles had all served in the armed forces. As the initial paralyzing panic threatened to overwhelm my sanity, a quiet, spiritual, protective instinct overrode my fear. My fingers frantically reached beneath the collar of my shirt, gripping the small silver crucifix hanging around my neck. I closed my eyes, bowed my head over the porcelain sink, and began to softly whisper a frantic, desperate prayer for the souls of the departed, begging for safe passage and asking the spirits to find their way back to the light. I reasoned through my hoarse whispers that these men weren't malicious predators. They were simply displaced, restless fragments of history bleeding through the thin veil of the cemetery boundary, seeking the temporary warmth of a building they had marched past decades ago. For 2 straight minutes, I stood there, praying blindly into the porcelain while the old wooden stalls rhythmically creaked and groaned as the shadows continued their silent, horologic rotation behind my back. The thick scent of machine oil vanished completely, replaced by an overwhelming, ancient odor of damp earth, wet canvas, and stale rain. Then, the rhythmic sliding sound stopped completely. The absolute silence returned to the restroom, sharper and colder than before. Slowly, with pure dread clawing at my stomach, I opened my eyes and looked back into the spotted mirror. The 4 silhouettes had stopped their march. They were standing perfectly still in the center of the room. The lead entity, a towering shadow whose helmet sat at a slight broken angle, had slowly turned its featureless, blurry face directly toward my reflection in the mirror. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel a heavy, freezing, unyielding gaze pinning my soul to the floorboards. The high, frosted glass windows behind the entity suddenly violently rattled and shook within their iron frames, as if an intense vacuum pressure was violently pulling from the cemetery side of the wall. A blood-curdling gasp tore out of my throat. Breaking the hypnotic lock of the entity, I lunged backward, violently kicked open the restroom fire door, and sprinted down the narrow concrete corridor as fast as my legs could carry me, not stopping until I burst out onto the bright, sweltering expanse of the empty assembly floor. At exactly 1 p.m., the loud, mechanical blast of the factory whistle blew, signaling the end of the break. Within minutes, the doors flew open, and the floor flooded with the loud chatter of 20 women and the familiar, grounding roar of the commercial sewing machines coming back to life. The modern reality of the daylight shift rushed back, completely swallowing the frozen nightmare of the lunch hour. I never told a single soul on my shift about what I saw. I knew they would think the midday heat had simply driven me into a state of temporary huang thuong. I still work at that garment factory today, and my machine runs smoothly through the daily schedule. I hit my production quotas, and the routine of my life has returned to a standard, quiet pace. But I never stay behind for the lunch hour anymore. The moment the midday whistle blows, I am the very first person to grab my bag and walk out to my car. Every now and then, when the winter rain hits the valley and the fog rolls thick off the Susquehanna River, I find myself parking my car near the northern edge of the lot. I look over the low, ivy-covered stone wall toward the long, silent rows of white marble markers marching down the hillside. They look perfectly peaceful under the gray sky. But as the clock approaches 12:30 p.m., a freezing thought lingers in the back of my mind, realizing that though the assembly lines are loud enough to drown out the dead, the lock on that restroom door is the only thing standing between the living and a silent military march that is simply waiting for the factory to go quiet again. We are drawn to high-end wellness centers by the promise of restoration, believing that luxury and clinical precision are absolute guarantees of safety. But some establishments don't rely on modern science to build their empires. They open subterranean channels to dark, parasitic forces that demand a terrifying toll from everyone under their roof. I thought I was just starting a quiet new career. I didn't know I was stepping into a business fueled by the literal rot of the dead. It started in the bitter, freezing transition of early winter 2019 in the historic loop of downtown Chicago. My name is Thomas, and for over 30 years, my entire life had been defined by the independent town car industry. I knew every alleyway, every shifting shadow of the skyline, and the quiet rhythm of the city after dark. But the rapid, aggressive rise of corporate ride-sharing apps completely gutted my business. In my late 50s, with my savings rapidly evaporating, I found myself facing a desperate financial precipice. Needing a stable, hands-on income stream that wouldn't require a screen, I invested my remaining funds into an intensive certification program for deep tissue neuromuscular therapy. I had a natural, practical awareness of human anatomy, and by the end of the year, I managed to secure a position at a highly prestigious boutique sports rehabilitation and holistic wellness center located on the upper floors of a beautifully restored 1920s brick building. Outwardly, the clinic was an oasis of modern luxury. High-earning corporate lawyers, elite athletes, and wealthy metropolitan clients filled our schedule, paying premium rates for advanced physical adjustments. The rooms were lined with polished hardwood floors, expensive minimalist artwork, and the air was permanently saturated with the clean, synthetic hum of expensive air purifiers and premium lavender oils. But beneath the pristine surface of the commercial success, a heavy, toxic static began to bleed into my consciousness. The first anomaly was centered around a massive antique wooden cabinet located in the far corner of the staff lounge. It was beautifully carved from dark mahogany, permanently secured with a heavy iron latch, and the facility director strictly commanded all new hires never to place any personal items or wet linens on its surface. He claimed it was an invaluable family artifact used purely for decorative chiotai, commercial wealth-binding aesthetics. But within my first week on the job, every single time I walked past that dark corner, an immediate, stomach-turning sensation hit the back of my throat. The air surrounding the mahogany cabinet didn't smell like the organic oils used on the floor. It carried a thick, nauseating, distinct odor of pure decay, the unmistakable powdery stench of crushed human bone shards and stagnant cemetery soil. It was so intense, it made my lungs burn. Yet, whenever I cautiously questioned my coworkers, they looked at me with complete confusion, insisting they smelled absolutely nothing but fresh linens and clean steam. I am a deeply devout, practicing Catholic, raised in a traditional parish where my family has attended services for generations. Long before I entered the industrial workplace, my parish priest had blessed a heavy, dark olive wood rosary bead bracelet that I wore tightly around my left wrist. I had worn that sacred cord for over 15 years. I had survived highway accidents, blinding winter blizzards, and severe personal hardships without a single thread fraying. But on my third day at the center, While I was simply organizing clean towels in the quiet lounge, the reinforced nylon cord of the bracelet abruptly snapped with a loud physical crack, scattering the blessed wooden beads across the floorboards. Shaken by the unprovoked break, I spent the evening carefully rethreading the beads onto a thick, industrial-grade fishing line. But 24 hours later, while sitting alone in an empty treatment room between appointments, the fishing line violently sheared apart again, the heavy beads thumping loudly against the drywall. Over the course of 2 weeks, no matter how heavily I reinforced the cord, the blessed rosary broke 4 consecutive times. It felt exactly like a systemic, localized alarm system actively warning my soul that my protective aura was being violently rejected by the foundation of the building. The first extreme manifestation occurred during a late afternoon appointment with a prominent corporate executive. The client was suffering from chronic severe migraines and upper cervical tension. As I initiated a deep tissue manual pressure release along the base of his skull, the ambient air pressure inside the treatment room plummeted. The temperature dropped so severely that my skin instantly broke into goosebumps, and the executive's breathing turned shallow and mechanical. Suddenly, his body went completely rigid beneath my palms. His eyes rolled violently backward into his skull, leaving nothing but the bloodshot, veiny whites staring fixedly at the ceiling tiles. I froze, my fingers tensing on his neck. Before I could call out for a nurse, I instinctively tracked his frozen line of sight toward the dark corner above the massage table. My heart stopped. Materializing out of the solid brickwork was a vivid, skin-crawling entity. It carried the general proportions of a tall man, but its entire surface was a wet, raw, pulsating crimson, resembling exposed human muscle tissue, completely stripped of skin. Sprouting from its heavy skull were 2 thick, ridged, black animalistic horns, and a long, thin tail whipped silently through the shadow before the entity smoothly glided horizontally and dissolved straight into the plaster wall. The exact millisecond the entity vanished, the executive let out a deep groan and lost consciousness on the table, falling into a catatonic sleep. My head began to throb with an excruciating pain that felt exactly as if I had consumed an impossible amount of alcohol within a single second. A crushing wave of cognitive exhaustion that left me gasping for air. I was entirely convinced that the owners were utilizing a dark, parasitic attachment to siphon energy and fuel their commercial success. But the definitive proof dropped into my lap 3 days later. A local construction laborer staggered into our lobby, weeping in agonizing pain after falling from a flatbed truck. His right leg was completely mangled, twisted outward at an impossible, unnatural angle. I executed a rapid visual assessment and realized his thigh was completely unstable. A clear, textbook mid-shaft fracture of the femur. The bone was completely broken. I immediately turned to the receptionist and told her to call an emergency ambulance. But a veteran therapist, a man who had worked closely with the clinic director for over a decade, pushed me aside with surprising force. He grabbed the screaming laborer, dragged him into a private back room, and locked the heavy door. Through the wood, I listened to a sequence of strange, low-frequency rhythmic chants and heavy, vibrating thuds. 10 minutes later, the door swung open. To my absolute horror, the laborer walked out completely straight. He was smiling, laughing, and shaking the veteran therapist's hand, boisterously declaring that his severe pain had entirely vanished. It defied every single law of modern medicine and human biology. A snapped femur cannot heal in 10 minutes. Driven by a severe, adrenaline-fueled paranoia, I quietly followed the man out of the building, my driving instincts telling me that the reality of the room was completely distorted. The laborer walked across our paved parking lot with a perfect smooth stride. But the exact second his heavy leather boots stepped off the clinic's private property line and touched the public city sidewalk, a horrific wet crack echoed down the street. The illusion shattered instantaneously. The laborer let out a blood-curdling primal scream, his legs instantly buckling as he collapsed violently onto the concrete. Right before my eyes, his thigh bone physically ripped through the muscle tissue, resetting itself back into the mangled compound fracture that had been temporarily masked by the clinic's dark wealth-binding transaction. The dark energy only held dominion within their own property lines. Terrified for my sanity and the safety of my soul, I knew I had to escape. The upcoming annual family memorial service provided the perfect mandatory pretext. I formally submitted my immediate resignation, claiming I had to return to our rural family estate for an extended period. On my final afternoon, as I packed my private deep tissue oils into my gear bag, the clinic director blocked the exit doorway of the staff lounge. His face looked uncomfortably pale, his eyes completely hollow and dead. He held out a small iron bowl containing a thick, smoking charcoal smudge and pointed toward the locked mahogany cabinet. "Before you close your file with us, Thomas," he said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding rasp that rattled the windows. "You must burn this offering before the cabinet to ensure your departure doesn't disrupt our commercial flow. Light the smudge." Remembering the ruined olive wood rosary beads and the horrific compound fracture on the public sidewalk, the veil was completely lifted from my eyes. I looked him straight in his empty face, gripped my bag, and firmly said, "I am a Catholic. I don't burn offerings for your cabinets." I pushed past his shoulder, walked down the stairs, and burst out into the bright, freezing daylight of the city, never turning back. I returned to my family car service after that winter, completely abandoning the deep tissue industry. My income is modest, but the hours are standard, and the air around my life feels normal, quiet, and clean. I still wear a blessed rosary around my wrist, and the cord hasn't frayed a single time since I left downtown. But the psychological scars of those few weeks have permanently altered my reality. Every now and then, when I'm driving my car past that historic loop downtown around midnight and the winter fog rolls heavy off the lake, I find myself slowing down as I pass the old brick building. I look up at the dark windows of the upper floors, completely sterile under the city lights. They look perfectly serene. But as the shadows shift across the brickwork, a freezing thought lingers in the back of my mind, realizing that though the modern world runs on numbers and commercial contracts, there are corridors where the success is built on something far more sinister, and I can't shake the terrifying realization of what monstrous entities might still be quietly feeding inside that ornate cabinet, waiting for the next desperate soul to walk through the door.